Isaiah Berlin's Two Concepts of Liberty, Part 1. To coerce a man is to deprive him of freedom. Freedom from what? Almost every moralist in human history has praised freedom. Like happiness and goodness, like nature and reality, the meaning of this term is so porous that there is little interpretation that it seems able to resist. I do not propose to discuss either the history or the more than 200 senses of this protean word recorded by historians of ideas. I propose to examine no more than two of these senses, but those central ones with a great deal of human history behind them, and, I dare say, still to come. The first of these political senses of freedom or liberty, I shall use both words to mean the same, which, following much precedent, I shall call the negative sense, is involved in the answer to the question, what is the area within which the subject, a person or group of persons, is or should be left to do or be what he is able to do or be without interference by other persons. The second, which I shall call the positive sense, is involved in the answer to the question, what or who is the source of control or interference that can determine someone to do or be this rather than that? The two questions are clearly different, even though the answers to them may overlap. The notion of negative freedom. I am normally said to be free to the degree to which no man or body of men interferes with my activity. Political liberty, in this sense, is simply the area within which a man can act unobstructed by others. If I am prevented by others from doing what I could otherwise do, I am to that degree unfree. And if this area is contracted by other men beyond a certain minimum, I can be described as being coerced, or it may be enslaved. Coercion is not, however, a term that covers every form of inability. If I say that I am unable to jump more than 10 feet in the air, or cannot read because I am blind, or cannot understand the darker pages of Hegel, it would be eccentric to say that I am to that degree enslaved or coerced. Coercion implies the deliberate interference of other human beings within the area in which I could otherwise act. You lack political liberty or freedom only if you are prevented from attaining a goal by human beings. Mere incapacity to attain a goal is not lack of political freedom. This is brought out by the use of such modern expressions as economic freedom and its counterpart, economic slavery. It is argued very plausibly that if a man is too poor to afford something on which there is no legal ban, a loaf of bread, a journey around the world, recourse to the law courts, he is as little free to have it as he would be if it were forbidden him by law. If my poverty were a kind of disease which prevented me from buying bread or paying for the journey round the world or getting my case heard as lameness prevents me from running, this inability would not naturally be described as a lack of freedom, least of all political freedom. It is only because I believe that my inability to get a given thing is due to the fact that other human beings have made arrangements whereby I am, whereas others are not, prevented from having enough money with which to pay for it, that I think myself a victim of coercion or slavery. In other words, this use of the term depends on a particular social and economic theory about the causes of my poverty or weakness. If my lack of material means is due to my lack of mental or physical capacity, then I begin to speak of being deprived of freedom, and not simply about poverty, only if I accept the theory. If, in addition, I believe that I am being kept in want by a specific arrangement which I consider unjust or unfair, I speak of economic slavery or oppression. The nature of things does not madden us, only ill will does, said Rousseau. The criterion of oppression is the part that I believe to be played by other human beings, directly or indirectly, with or without the intention of doing so, in frustrating my wishes. By being free in this sense, I mean not being interfered with by others. The wider the area of non-interference, the wider my freedom. This is what the classical English political philosophers meant when they used this word. They disagreed about how wide the area could or should be. They supposed that it could not, as things were, be unlimited, because if it were, it would entail a state in which all men could boundlessly interfere with all other men. And this kind of natural freedom would lead to social chaos in which men's minimum needs would not be satisfied, or else the liberties of the weak would be suppressed by the strong, because they perceived that human purposes and activities do not automatically harmonize with one another, and because, whatever their official doctrines, they put high value on other goals, such as justice or happiness or culture or security or varying degrees of equality. They were prepared to curtail freedom in the interests of other values and indeed of freedom itself. For without this, it was impossible to create the kind of association that they thought desirable. Consequently, it is assumed by these thinkers that the area of men's free action must be limited by law. But equally, it is assumed, especially by such libertarians as Locke and Mill in England and Constant and Tocqueville in France, that there ought to exist a certain minimum area of personal freedom which must on no account be violated. For it is overstepped. The individual will find, for if it is overstepped, the individual will find himself in an area too narrow for even that minimum development of his natural faculties, which alone makes it possible to pursue, and even to conceive, the various ends which men hold good or right or sacred. It follows that a frontier must be drawn between the area of private life and of public authority. Where it is to be drawn is a matter of argument, indeed of haggling. Men are largely interdependent, and no man's activity is so completely private as never to obstruct the lives of others in any way. Freedom for the pike is death for the minnows. The liberty of some must depend on the restraint of others. Freedom for an Oxford Don, others have been known to add, is a very different thing from freedom for an Egyptian peasant. This proposition derives its force from something that is both true and important, but the phrase itself remains a piece of political claptrap. It is true that to offer political rights or safeguards against intervention by the state to men who are half-naked, illiterate, underfed, and diseased is to mock their condition. They need medical help or education before they can understand or make use of an increase in their freedom. What is freedom to those who cannot make use of it? Without adequate conditions for the use of freedom, what is the value of freedom? First things come first. There are situations, as a 19th century Russian radical writer declared, in which boots are superior to the works of Shakespeare. Individual freedom is not everyone's primary need. For freedom is not the mere absence of frustration of whatever kind. This would inflate the meaning of the word until it meant too much or too little. The Egyptian peasant needs clothes or medicine before, and more than, personal liberty. But the minimum freedom that he needs today and the greater degree of freedom that he may need tomorrow is not some species of freedom peculiar to him, but identical with that of professors, artists, and millionaires. The troubles the What troubles the consciences of Western liberals is not, I think, the belief that the freedom that men seek differs according to their social or economic conditions, but that the minority who possesses it have gained it by exploiting, or at least averting their gaze from, the vast majority who do not. They believe, with good reason, that if individual liberty is an ultimate end for human beings, none should be deprived of it by others. Least of all, that some should enjoy it at the expense of others. Equality of liberty, not to treat others as I should not wish them to treat me, repayment of my debt to those who alone have made possible my liberty, or prosperity, or enlightenment, justice, in its simplest and most universal sense. These are the foundations of liberal morality. Liberty is not the only goal of men. I can, like the Russian critic Belinsky, say that if others are to be deprived of it, if my brothers are to remain in poverty, squalor, and chains, then I do not want it for myself. I reject it with both hands and infinitely prefer to share their fate, but nothing is gained by a confusion of terms. To avoid glaring inequality or widespread misery, I am ready to sacrifice some or all of my freedom. I may do so willingly and freely, but it is freedom that I am giving up for the sake of justice or equality or the love of my fellow men. I should be guilt-stricken, and rightly so, if I were not, in some circumstances, ready to make the sacrifice. But a sacrifice is not an increase in what is being sacrificed, namely, freedom. However great the moral need or the compensation for it. Everything is what it is. Liberty is liberty, not equality or fairness or justice or culture or human happiness or quiet conscience. If the liberty of myself or my class or nation depends on the misery of a number of other human beings, the system which promotes this is unjust and immoral. But if I curtail or lose my freedom in order to lessen the shame of such inequality, and do not thereby materially increase the individual liberty of others, an absolute loss of liberty occurs. This may be compensated for by a gain in justice, or in happiness, or in peace, but the loss remains, and it is a confusion of values to say that although my liberal individual freedom may go by the board, some other kind of freedom, social or economic, is increased. Yet it remains true that the freedom of some must at times be curtailed to secure the freedom of others. Upon what principle should this be done? If freedom is sacred, if freedom is a sacred, untouchable value, there can be no such principle. One or other of these conflicting rules or principles must, at any rate, in practice, yield, not always for reasons which can be clearly stated, let alone generalized into rules or universal maxims. Still, a practical compromise has to be found. Philosophers with an optimistic view of human nature and a belief in the possibility of harmonizing human interests, such as Locke, Adam Smith, and in some moods Mill, believed that social harmony and progress were compatible with reserving a large area for private life, over which neither the state nor any other authority must be allowed to trespass. Hobbes and those who agreed with him, especially conservative or reactionary thinkers, argued that if men were to be prevented from destroying one another and making social life a jungle or a wilderness, greater safeguards must be instituted to keep them in their places. He wished correspondingly to increase the area of centralized control and decrease that of the individual. But both sides agreed that some portion of human existence must remain independent of the sphere of social control. To invade that preserve, however small, would be despotism. The most eloquent of all defenders of freedom and privacy, Benjamin Constant, who had not forgotten the Jacobin dictatorship, declared that at the very least the liberty of religion, opinion, expression, property must be guaranteed against arbitrary invasion. Jefferson, Burke, Paine, Mill compiled different catalogues of individual liberties, but the argument for keeping authority at bay is always substantially the same. We must preserve a minimum area of personal freedom if we are not to degrade or deny our nature. We cannot remain absolutely free and must give up some of our liberty to preserve the rest. But total self-surrender is self-defeating. What then must the minimum be? That which a man cannot give up without offending against the essence of his human nature. What is the essence? What are the standards which it entails? This has been, and perhaps always will be, a matter of infinite debate. But whatever the principle in terms of which the area of non-interference is to be drawn, whether it is that of natural law or natural rights, or of utility, or the pronouncements of a categorical imperative, or the sanctity of the social contract, or any other concept with which men have sought to clarify and justify their convictions. Liberty in this sense means liberty from absence of interference beyond the shifting but always recognizable frontier. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, said the most celebrated of its champions. If this is so, is compulsion ever justified? Mill had no doubt that it was, since justice demands that all individuals be entitled to a minimum of freedom. All other individuals were of necessity to be restrained, if need be, by force, from depriving anyone of it. Indeed, the whole function of law was the prevention of just such collisions. The state was reduced to what Lassalle contemptuously described as the functions of a night watchman or traffic policeman. What made the protection of individual liberty so sacred to Mill? In his famous essay, he declares that unless men are left to live as they wish in the path which merely concerns themselves, civilization cannot advance. The truth will not, for lack of free market and ideas, come to light. There will be no scope for spontaneity, originality, genius, for mental energy, for moral courage. Society will be crushed by the weight of collective mediocrity. Whatever is rich and diversified will be crushed by the weight of custom, by men's constant tendency to conformity, which breeds only withered capacities, pinched and hidebound, cramped and warped human beings. Pagan self-assertion is as worthy as Christian self-denial. All the errors which a man is likely to commit against advice and warning are far outweighed by the evil of allowing others to constrain him to what they deem is good. The defense of liberty consists in the negative goal of warding off interference. To threaten a man with persecution unless he submits to a life in which he exercises no choices of his own goals. To block before him every door but one, no matter how noble the prospect upon which it opens, or how benevolent the motives of those who arrange this, is to sin against the truth that he is a man, a being with a life of his own to live. This is liberty. as it has been conceived by liberals in the modern world from the days of Erasmus, some would say of Occam, to our own. Every plea for civil liberties and individual fights, every protest against exploitation and humiliation, against the encroachment of public authority or the mass hypnosis of custom or organized propaganda, springs from this individualistic and much disputed conception of man. 3 facts about this position may be noted. In the first place, Mill confuses 2 distinct notions. One is that all coercion is, insofar as it frustrates human desires, bad as such, although it may have to be applied to prevent other greater evils, while non-interference, which is the opposite of coercion, is good as such, although it is not the only good. This is the negative conception of liberty in its classical form. The other is that men should seek to discover the truth, or to develop a certain type of character of which Mill approved: critical, original, imaginative, independent, non-conforming to the pursuit of eccentricity, and so on. And that truth can be found, and such character can be bred only in conditions of freedom. Both these are liberal views, but they are not identical, and the connection between them is at best empirical. No one would argue that truth or freedom of self-expression could flourish where dogma crushes all thought. But the evidence of history tends to show, as indeed was argued by James Stephen in his formidable attack on Mill in his Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, that integrity, love of truth, and fiery individualism grow at least as often in severely disciplined communities among, for example, the Puritan Calvinists of Scotland or New England, or under military discipline as in more tolerant or indifferent societies. And if this is so, Mill's argument for liberty as a necessary condition for the growth of human genius falls to the ground. If his 2 goals proved incompatible, Mill would be faced with the cruel dilemma, quite apart from the further difficulties created by the inconsistency of his doctrines with strict utilitarianism, even in his own humane version of it. In the second place, the doctrine is comparatively modern. There seems to be scarcely any discussion of individual liberty as a conscious political ideal, as opposed to its actual existence in the ancient world. Condorcet had already remarked that the notion of individual rights was absent from the legal conceptions of the Romans and Greeks. This seems to hold equally of the Jewish, Chinese, and all other ancient civilizations that have since come to light. The domination of this ideal has been the exception rather than the rule, even in the recent history of the West. Nor has liberty, in this sense, often formed a rallying cry for the great masses of mankind. The desire not to be impinged upon, to be left for oneself, has been a mark of high civilization, both on the part of individuals and communities. The sense of privacy itself, of the area of personal relationships as something sacred in its own right, derives from the conception of freedom, which for all its religious roots is scarcely older in its developed state than the Renaissance or the Reformation. Yet its decline would mark the death of a civilization of an entire moral outlook. The third characteristic of this notion of liberty is of greater importance. It is that liberty in the sense is not incompatible with the same kinds of autocracy, or at any rate with the absence of self-government. Liberty in this sense is principally concerned with the area of control, not with its source. just as a democracy may, in fact, deprive the individual citizen of a great many liberties which he might have in some other form of society, so it is perfectly conceivable that a liberal-minded despot would allow his subjects a large measure of personal freedom. The despot who leaves his subjects a wide area of liberty may be unjust, or encourage the wildest inequalities, care little for order, or virtue, or knowledge, but provided he does not curb their liberty, or at least curbs it less than many other regimes, he meets with Mill's specification. Freedom in this sense is not, at any rate, logically connected with democracy or self-government. Self-government may, on the whole, provide a better guarantee of the preservation of civil liberties than other regimes, and has been defended as such by libertarians. But there is no necessary connection between individual liberty and democratic rule. The answer to the question, who governs me, is logically distinct from the question, how far does government interfere with me? It is this difference that the great contrast between the two concepts of negative and positive liberty in the end consists. For the positive sense of liberty comes to light if we try to answer the question, not what am I free to do or be, but by whom am I ruled? Or who is to say what I am and what I am not to be or do? The connection between democracy and individual liberty is a good deal more tenuous than it seems to many advocates of both. The desire to be governed by myself, or at any rate participate in the process by which my life is to be controlled, may be as deep a wish as that of a free area for action, and perhaps historically older, but it is not a desire for the same thing. So different is it, indeed, as to have led in the end to the great clash of ideologies that dominates our world. For it is this, the positive conception of liberty, not freedom from, but freedom to lead one prescribed form of life, which the adherents of the negative notion represent as being, at times, no better than a specious disguise for brutal tyranny.